Teach me about the Great Lakes. Teach me about the Great Lakes. Welcome back to Teach Me About the Great Lakes, a periodic, we say twice monthly, but I don't even know what our release schedule is anymore, podcast in which I, a Great Lakes novice, ask people who are smarter and harder working than I am to teach me all about the Great Lakes. My name is Stuart Carlton, and I know a lot about going to the ATM to take out $300 to buy a new guitar amp, finding out that the ATM is broken, looking at your watch, realizing the dude is going to meet you at the school parking lot in 6 minutes, running home, borrowing money from your kids to then buy the guitar amp. But I don't know a lot about the Great Lakes, and that's the point of this show. So that's why we're here. But it's not, when I say we, I don't mean the royal we, because I'm actually not royalty. I mean, I'm joined today by the queen of teaching about the Great Lakes herself, Megan, the lake lover, Gunn. Megan, bought a guitar amp lately?
No, I haven't, but I'm curious as to how your children didn't spend all their money on candy or things before they...
Because my children, their life is so over full with joy and pleasure that they can't see why they would spend that money. They just hoard it. Like orcs in the Rings of Power. Just hoard it.
Or anyway. Roblox. That's what the kids do nowadays.
We'll have to trust you.
Okay.
I am unaware of Roblox. We've gotten far afield. The point is this. It's surprising we have. But we have.
So quickly.
You know, I was thinking about episode 101 lately. A couple episodes ago.
Yes.
And it featured 2 journalists. Do you remember that? Were you part of that? Yeah, you were there with some journalists.
I was there.
Yeah, they were so good. We thought we'd have another one on.
I love talking to journalists.
Yeah,
they have so much good information.
They're good information. They're good at talking. Mm-hmm. Unlike some of the scientists we talk. I'm not talking about any specific guests, but sometimes scientists they're not communication professionals. At least not that sort of communication.
No, not to regular people.
No,
that's what our listeners are. Sorry if some of you listeners are not just regular people.
No, they're mostly graduate students. Very few of them are regular.
Yeah.
If nothing else, the regular thing is not to listen to this show. Yes. That is by far the more common behavior. So they're weirdos. Anyway, the point is this: we've got Michael Hawthorne from the Chicago Tribune. But first, since he's in the Chicago area, we have our special Chicago theme song. Yeah. Our guest today, I recorded that remember we did a live thing at the Great Lakes Network meeting in Edmonton. Yeah. And so I recorded that for that, but then we had so many audio difficulties that I never actually got to play it. So nobody heard it. So this is the first time it's been sitting there I was so pumped.
Well, it's the first time I think I've ever been introduced with music. So
there we go.
Welcome.
Yes. And the person we are introducing is Michael Hawthorne. He covers environmental issues for Chicago Tribune. A lot of all sorts of environmental stuff, as you can imagine, but a focus on the Great Lakes oftentimes. So, Mike, as you're thinking about the Great Lakes now, what are the issues that come to top of mind, environmentally speaking? What are some things, you know what it is when you're an environmental reporter, a lot of times your job is to report bad news or to report depth on bad news. So give me some bad news about Lake Michigan, Mike.
Well, the one thing that stands out is that pretty much every fish in Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes in general that's been sampled for the forever chemicals, PFAS, PFAS, the levels in those fish are really high. And it basically, the research, this was about a year ago, I think, that I wrote about this study, based on testing by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency over the years. And the researchers who looked at the results of this tissue sampling and blood samples from the fish found that basically they kind of did like extrapolation and compared it to drinking PFAS contaminated drinking water, which is another issue that we have in the lakes and in the country and in the world, really. And it wouldn't take a lot of fish to essentially exceed what is considered unsafe through drinking water. So There have been stories in the last couple of years about, for example, the smelt population on Lake Superior that native tribes depend on. It doesn't take a lot of little smelt to really give you a big dose of these chemicals, and getting them out of our environment likely is going to be even more difficult than the challenges that have and the chemicals and the other waste that have contaminated the world's largest source of fresh drinking water over the course of history. And that's staggering because there is good news. I mean, a lot of the really bad chemicals from the past, those levels have decreased in the lakes, large part because of regulations and laws that were enacted in many cases, in the 1970s. But what regulators, even before, this upcoming Trump 2 administration, are having difficulty coming to grips with that. And it's a question of whether the laws and the regulations can be enacted fast enough to prevent further harm. So that's of great interest to me. And even though, for example, say like testing in treated Chicago drinking water has both found and not found some of these chemicals. So, and other places, on the Michigan side of the lake and also in Wisconsin, the chemicals are out there. I think of the lakes as a big sponge, and they're soaking up all these things that we're putting into the environment, and many of these substances, chemicals and metals, well, especially the chemicals, transfer pretty easily, unfortunately, between air, land, and water. So, and then if you really want to get depressed, just think about the plastics issue. It's just staggering. Basically, we've got 70 years of plastic in Lake Michigan, and a drop of water that falls in Lake Michigan doesn't leave the lake for a really long time. So, unlike some of these other chemicals like the PCBs and whatnot that sink to the bottom and get basically locked in the sediment, unless disturbed, aren't necessarily that harmful, except to bottom-feeding fish. We've done it to ourselves, and as a researcher put it to me many years ago, and something that stuck with me is we're basically, as a society, conducting a giant uncontrolled experiment on human beings and wildlife, fish. Yeah. So it's kind of depressing, and can be overwhelming. I see my role as, at least let's get people talking about this, because then maybe we can actually do something about it. And if it's not widely known, any of these challenges or threats to the quality and health of the Great Lakes, I mean, that's a big deal. 20 million people get their drinking water, right? That's a lot of people, and both here in the States and also in Canada. And it's the kind of thing that most other countries don't have. So we're really fortunate, and we just need to do a better job taking care of them.
And what's particularly notable about the two you talked about the what they call the forever chemicals, or PFAS. Some people, because one of them is, some people say PFAS, so you don't get it confused with the PFOS. PFOS, but PFAS, I'm not saying PFAS. In fact, I've said PFAS enough already. But anyway, the point is, what's rough about them and the microplastics, it's these invisible things, right? And so there's something in my line of work we call dread risk, which is this notion of something that you dread. And one of the things that can lead people to dread is when it's unknowable in nature. Yeah. And everywhere we're looking, we're finding these. And so they did that study with fish, and they found them in fish. But they're still in the process of doing studies on other forms of protein and other whatever. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if we end up finding out, well, it's not just fish. It is fish, but
especially if it's in the air.
Yeah, it's in the air, right?
Well, in the Northeast of Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, they've been testing big game and finding it there. And there's this whole issue also of that I've written about quite a bit is the land application of sewage sludge on farms. And so that sludge, actually, these chemicals end up concentrated in the sludge. The conventional sewage treatment not only doesn't remove the chemicals from waste, human and industrial waste, it actually concentrates them. Then you're going to go spread it on a field as free fertilizer. And
I have never been here to be a vegetarian.
Can we go back?
There's an example of a Michigan farmer who, he can't sell his animals, and now the state of Michigan is actually using his farm as essentially a test of whether you can essentially feed and water cattle and get the PFAS out of them, because he can't sell his meat anymore. It's crazy, and there probably should be a lot more testing done of farms and farmland and wells. A lot of people in rural areas are on wells. Are they contaminated? Right? We don't know necessarily because nobody's looking. And other than that one farmer, Jason Grostic in Southwest Michigan, not a lot of farms have been tested in this country other than in the state of Maine. And now you've got a situation where Maine, their legislature and governor have passed laws essentially giving money to farmers to try to make them whole for their losses. And whether we see that coming up in the Great Lakes states where a lot of this is happening is still unknown. But again, the only reason it's unknown is because people aren't looking for it. And in my belief, based on my reporting, they don't want to know because the answer is pretty damn scary.
I believe it. Just all these things that you're saying, scary.
A former colleague of mine used to sit across from me, and he's a science writer too, right? But he said, "It must suck being you." I'm one of those people that with my family and friends, I could be like overlooking, like say I think of a specific example. It's like we're in Southern California overlooking the ocean at sunset, and it's just so beautiful. And what do I blurt out? I'm like, what's up with all those oil derricks out there? Right? So, it's that Debbie Downer character from Saturday Night Live. But, people, what I do find, I've been doing this now, writing about the environment for 25 years, and, it resonates with people. And I was a political reporter beforehand, and other than, the political community, I didn't get nearly the feedback from readers that I get from my stories as an environment reporter. And that's been the case for all 24 years. So it's one reason why I keep doing it.
I think that's because people more and more feel more connected to the environment and see that they can have some kind of impact, change in that way. And so I guess
there are examples of that actually working. I'm going back a while. This is 2007, but a reader had called me and said, "Hey, I hear something. I'm not quite sure if this is true. I'm hoping you can look into it. But it sure seems like the state of Indiana is getting ready to allow the big oil company BP to increase the amount of pollution it dumps into Lake Michigan from its refinery on the southwestern shore of the lake in Whiting, Indiana." So, digging into that, sure enough, that's what they were going to do. And the outcry, this was a story in like July of 2007. And, I thought it was a good story and it was interesting. It was going to get people talking, but the outcry was just intense. And you had the point where you had elected leaders, in Illinois, especially, really vociferously opposing this effort. You ended up having the US EPA step in and essentially getting BP to back down. And eventually the mayor of Chicago at that time, Richard M. Daley, the CEO or the American or North American CEO of CEO came to the mayor's office and said, "We're not going to do this." And to the point where like at the Lollapalooza Music Festival that summer, I was there with a friend and may not have been, in the most cogent state at that point of the evening, but all of a sudden, Eddie Vedder, the lead singer of Pearl Jam, starts reading from one of my stories about the BP situation, right? And so it really resonated, right? It to multiple levels, not just with politicians, but then with, one of the biggest rock groups in the world. It it was humbling and staggering, and it was also a sign that, hey, there's a lot of stuff going on, and people are distracted by so many things, even more so today than in 2007. But as you said, Megan, they care. They care about our lakes. They care about our drinking water. And, I'm lucky to work for a publication that, even though, we've gone through a lot of hardship and a lot of, layoffs and buyouts and things like that, different owners that, aren't necessarily interested in journalism, but, we keep going on. But, predecessors in my job, we had a guy named Casey Buckrow. He was one of the first environment reporters in the whole country. And I look back when Casey retired, this was more than a decade ago, I was asked to write for one of the editors, like basically an appreciation of Casey. So I went back to his stories from, the 50s and 60s. He was writing about this stuff then. They had a whole series then called Save Our Great Lake, about Lake Michigan. And he and a colleague, Bill Jones, went around the lakes, and they were writing about the Cuyahoga River catching on fire before the fire that actually
before the big one
helped lead to the passage of the 1972 Clean Water Act. So, I see myself also as a steward of a legacy that I'm fortunate enough to be able to revisit some of those stories that he wrote about years ago. Because as a mentor once mentioned to me, environment stories don't break, they ooze. And so, the forever chemicals, for example, I first wrote about those in 2002, right? And so I was always looking for a way to get back to it. But as I joke when I speak to civic groups and students, I kind of move up and down the periodic table. And so
right.
I took a break from fluorine for a while and went to bromine, right? And then, and then lead.
Well, now you go back to fluoride.
Right.
So,
maybe I'm going to have to do that too, right? Yeah.
We'll see. All right, you're leaving a lot here on the table I got to pick up. So I've got my little notebook. I'm on Lake Ontario, my little field notes notebook. All right. So I've written down little notes, things I got to ask about. Going back to smelt. Are you a smelt guy or a schmelt guy?
I do love smelt. I remember we had an outdoors writer at the Tribune before my time, but his name was John Hussar. He had a weekly column, like in the Sunday sports section. Yeah. And once a year, there was a big smelt run in the Chicago area on Lake Michigan. That doesn't exist anymore. It's more like the northern part of the lake and Lake Superior. But John would write an annual column about doing the smelt bake. And what his favorite recipes were, or what readers' favorite recipes were. So that's what drew me to smelt in the first place. And usually in the spring, there's at least one or two restaurants in town that'll have smelt on the menu for a short period of time. So
there we go. So this is my next question: is Calumet? So my friend down the street, my neighbor and friend, Whiskey Club Steve, he's from Chicago, and he says Calumet Fisheries. On the 95th Street Bridge is the place to go for smelt. Can you confirm or deny?
I can confirm. It's a great place to go for lake trout and salmon. Yeah, I spend a lot of time in that neighborhood. It's the east side neighborhood, the far southeast side of the city, really close to the Indiana border. And pretty much every chance I get, if I'm reporting down there, I stop in at Calumet Fisheries.
Excellent. I'll have to check that out. Oh. And then the last one I had on that is it true that whoever smelt it dealt it?
I've been stuck on a bus a few times with a bunch of reporters, including your colleague Sandy. So yeah, I would have to say that's probably true.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. So this is interesting. Normally I derail the guests and then we can sometimes come back or not, but you're so dialed in. I try to derail you, not this time, and you come back with more depressing news. So I don't know what is it about the environment bent that gives you that. All right, one more little pickup I got, and this is important. Did you get to go backstage then after Eddie Vedder read your
not that time, not that time, but
not that time.
I have a friend. I guess Mr. Vedder and I have a mutual friend, and so Ed, as our friend calls him, and we were. The Pearl Jam was playing at the Alpine Valley music
Sure,
theater
Wisconsin.
in Wisconsin. And I went up with my friend and another friend, and our mutual friend just kept saying, well, when we get there, Ed will tell us what we need to do.
Okay.
And I'm like, who's Ed?
Who's Ed?
And
You didn't think it was that Ed? Yeah.
we were on the side of the stage for that show. It was pretty cool.
Look at that. That is cool.
Yeah.
The third greatest American rock band.
I'm a lifelong Chicago Cubs fan, and so is Eddie Vedder, and so we've crossed paths a few times in that respect. But if we saw each other, he wouldn't remember me. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, no, that's what you claim. Yeah, and then Pearl Jam. Just for the record, we've done a lot of this in a lot of debate on our Slack and everything. Pearl Jam is the third greatest American rock band, so that's pretty good. Pretty good.
Yeah, I saw them again this summer at Wrigley Field.
Oh, yeah.
It was better than I've ever seen them before. It was
somebody I coached baseball with went to that, and they said it was really good. And what was cool is at this point, Pearl Jam's getting a little long in the tooth, as are many of us, right? Longer each year. But so so what? 10 came out. I'm not the world's biggest Pearl Jam fan, but 10 came out in about, 91, 92, somewhere in there. So you're talking 30 years ago. So the people at that show have been singing these same songs, especially because Pearl Jam hasn't released a relevant album since about 1994. And they've been singing
I would
these
argue
same
with
songs.
I would argue with it. You want that?
No, all right.
One of their best in years.
That's what they say. They lost me. So I really liked, all right. So all right. I was into a girl who was into Pearl Jam in the 90s. And so I didn't, 10 was fine. I really like that next album, Versus. Yeah. No, that was the one after.
Yeah, you're right. That's true. Versus was a great record.
I know. Yeah, Versus is the one that had the two different CD packaging. The first couple 100,000 had this unusual kind, and they stopped doing it. It's too expensive. I have one with the unusual packaging, still sitting at home, assuming the kids haven't. And then Vitology, loved Vitology, and then they completely lost me after that.
It did for me for a while too, but I realized I guess I'm kind of like you at the time, contemporaneously. I mean, I liked Pearl Jam, but I really liked Nirvana.
Huh.
Right.
I know Nirvana.
Okay.
I would have arguments with my friends. We're in our mid 20s at this point, and we're saying, who's going to be remembered more, Eddie Vedder or Kurt Cobain, right?
Right.
So.
Okay, well, bringing us back to the Great
And the
Lakes.
answer now is, unfortunately, there's some staying power matters, and Nirvana is not going to have that. Okay, bringing us back to the Great Lakes.
So you, Mike, you started with some very depressing stories. Is there one feel-good story that you have, or one story that you wrote that you are so proud of the action that was taken afterwards? Like the people really rallied, very similar to the BP story, or just another one?
That's one there. There were there's a bunch of them actually. I mean, and this was a situation in Detroit as well. Actually, predated the discovery of it here in the Chicago area.
East of Ann Arbor, most people know. Near
Calumet Fisheries, a company owned by the Koch Industries, the Koch brothers. Now there's just one of them still alive, and they were storing massive piles of petroleum coke along the Calumet River, just a little bit.
Your title.
Just a little bit downstream from Calumet Fisheries. And it was blowing into a predominantly low-income, predominantly Latino neighborhood. And nobody was doing anything about it. And this company basically ignored them. You had a situation where people had to close their windows. It was ruining picnics and Little League baseball games nearby.
Not the kids.
And so, and it also goes back to the BP refinery again. BP they were producing more of this petroleum coke. It's a byproduct from production of fuels, gasoline and other fuels. And it's a waste product, but this Koch Industries subsidiary figured out a way to make waste from refineries, petroleum coke, into essentially a commodity, selling it to aluminum smelters and then also to a handful of the petroleum coke is cheaper than the coal. Also, though, very high in carbon, huge contributor to climate change, and also really dirty, right? And so, folks I wrote about this, and I wrote about how the holding facility on Chicago's southeast side had been around for a while, but it was due to get even bigger, like significantly bigger, because BP in Whiting, Indiana, just over the border, under a settlement they reached with federal prosecutors, they had to safely store their petroleum coke so the dust wouldn't escape the facility and drift into nearby neighborhoods. So what they did is they just shipped it over the border about 10 miles and left them in these giant piles that were then affecting people in this neighborhood. And the outcry was significant once again. I went to a meeting at a church on the southeast side, and I've never seen citizens so angry. The poor people from the public outreach team at the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, I thought they were going to get burned at the stake. It was that angry. And eventually, though, like all these politicians, then Mayor Rahm Emanuel, easy also because Koch Industries, the Koch brothers, big backers of right-wing causes, anti-environment causes, and Republicans in general. Rahm Emanuel, former aide to Democratic President Bill Clinton, Democratic mayor of Chicago, would not miss an opportunity to stay. And they eventually withdrew the piles. And that situation then had a ripple effect where air monitoring that the US EPA had put around this pet coke facility also picked up the signature of manganese, also used in steel production, can cause brain damage. High levels of manganese in the air wasn't coming from the Koch brothers site. It was coming from another location a little bit further downstream on the Calumet River. And then that led to testing of residential yards around this other manganese holding facility. They found high levels of manganese in the soil, and this company was forced to clean up those yards and replace it with clean soil. And that led to other things. So eventually, all of these, and the neighborhood has a pretty well oiled environmental justice nonprofit. In that period, when the pet coke situation, this was maybe 2013, if I recall correctly, that group was kind of in a bit of transition. It was a new generation of leaders coming into that group, and they ran with it to the point now where, like, a woman who formed another group called the Southeast Side Coalition Against Pet Coke, she was just named to the Chicago School Board by our mayor here. So it led to other issues. A scrap shredding company made plans to move their shredder from the predominantly wealthy white north side to this same southeast side neighborhood where all these other issues had raised concern. That story about the petroleum coke led to another decade's worth of stories about other environmental hazards in that community, and led ultimately to the US EPA and the Department of Housing and Urban Development to reach legal settlements with the city of Chicago that blocked this shredder from operating on the southeast side, and also called for a more citywide look at the cumulative effects of pollution on especially Black and brown neighborhoods. And while that's a slow process, they are locked in through a court-ordered settlement to actually do something about that. So that one story from 2013 led to all these other stories, and eventually something that might benefit the entire city, not just one of its most industrial impacted neighborhoods.
This is the feel good I was hoping for. So thank you so much.
It is really interesting.
It took a lot of hard work, though, right? And people ended up on the scrap shredder. There was a hunger strike, including a social studies teacher at the neighborhood high school. That from the upper story you could see the scrap shredder, right? And an air monitor already on top of that school. That shows some of the dirtiest air in the entire city, and indeed in the entire region, and that includes all the big steel mills in Northwest Indiana. So,
you mean like a literal hunger strike?
A literal hunger strike, yeah.
Huh. I guess they didn't mind stealing bread from the mouths of the decadent. And that is a deep cut, Eddie Vedder. You can look that one up. Google it. Temple of the Dog.
Yep. Blaylock.
There we go. Mike, it's been really interesting actually to have you on. It's really fascinating to hear about all the work you're doing, depressing and otherwise, to hear about massive piles of petroleum coke, to discuss the different eras of Pearl Jam and what have you. But that's actually not why we had you here on Teach Me About the Great Lakes this week. The reason that we had you on Teach Me About the Great Lakes is to ask you two questions. The first of which is this. If you could have a great donut for breakfast or a great sandwich for lunch, which one would you have?
Oh, definitely sandwich.
Sandwich.
Ooh.
I love a good sandwich. There's a great sandwich shop on Grand Avenue in Chicago called Tempesta. They also make their own meats and all this other kind of sausages and things like that, but they have fantastic sandwiches. And that's just one of many places that I love to frequent for lunch when I can.
No, I'm writing it down. Tempesta. We'll check it out. We'll put that link in the show notes.
Yeah. So
Chicago is a good sandwich city. I'm from New Orleans, which is also a good sandwich city.
It's hard
for me to find a sandwich worth having. Well, not worth having, worth mentioning, I guess would be better. But Chicago has a notable sandwich or two. Fantastic.
Yes.
Tempesta.
The thing that I would like to know is there a special place in the Great Lakes that you'd like to share with our audience? And what makes it special?
Up the lake shore from Duluth, Minnesota, I think the Lake Superior shoreline is just beautiful. I go there with my children pretty much every summer. We go to the Boundary Waters, and usually the lake that we put in at is maybe about a half hour away from Lake Superior. But there's just amazing parks on the lakeshore there. There's also if you go all the way farther to the, you're almost to International Falls. There's a ferry that takes you to Isle Royal, the national park in Lake Superior. And I would say that's probably the most special place I've ever been. I've camped there during the moose rut. I've been with a now retired researcher who studied the relationship between moose and wolves on Isle Royal. Actually went bushwhacking on the island for moose bones. Almost was charged by a bull moose until a colleague that was with us accidentally stepped on a hornet's nest and shrieked.
Oh my gosh.
And that scared the bull away, saving us all.
Jeez.
So that's a pretty special place. But I mean, I'm lucky enough to have some friends who have a place on the big lake north of Muskegon. And it's so remote. It's just nothing but cherry orchards up there and beautiful homes and
holy smokes! Lake. So why are you so depressed in all your work? Your life is amazing, Mike. This is.
I guess okay. I'm going to bring it back to the depressing part. This place is so remote, but it's kind of a part of Michigan that juts out furthest west into Lake Michigan. And every morning on this, what seems to be this beautiful, pristine beach, there's just microplastics everywhere.
Yeah.
Right?
Can't see them.
There's a general store like associated with a cherry orchard near where my friends live. And behind the register, you know how some people can collect coins like quarters in like a big giant glass jar or something?
Yeah, I tend to spend them, but I'm aware of this.
This one is full of like these little cigar tips, plastic cigar tips, cigarillos or Swisher Sweets.
Yeah.
And it's what people pick up on the beach. So somehow
Thank you, Mike, for this roller
being
coaster.
washed out from sewage, whatever, right? Sewage overflows into the lake, and eventually, the gyre of the lake ends up depositing this stuff on our beautiful, supposedly pristine beaches. So once again, an example of why, bringing attention to that is so important, and trying to essentially, like with the forever chemicals, we got to turn the tap off first before we can, start trying to come to grips with the consequences.
Michael Hawthorne of the Chicago Tribune, thank you for coming on, teaching us all about the Great Lakes.
Appreciate it.
I'm mean, it was all fine. Like, it was all good. We're ending on a nice little upbeat thing. We're talking sandwiches, talking beautiful remote places.
And a roller coaster ride.
Roller coaster ride. That's okay.
Up and down.
Interesting
life.
perspective. No, interesting perspective. So no Pearl Jam. You've not heard of Pearl Jam?
No.
You seriously haven't?
No, that big album that they came out in 1992.
Yeah.
I was all of 2 years old, so literally a baby.
Now I am that different. No, that's yeah. Well, anyway, no. Pearl Jam is the third greatest American rock band. Behind REM is second.
Okay.
And the Grateful Dead is first.
I've heard of them.
Because you have to look at a combination of yes, popular success, and Grateful Dead were not that popularly successful, but there was a longevity associated with them, and they were hugely popular. They sold out stadiums, and Grateful Dead, more than any other band, encompasses all forms of American music, or at least all the ones up until then. So that is why, despite the fact that I'm not a Deadhead, unlike Paris Collinsworth,
Okay,
I'm not a Deadhead. The Grateful Dead is the greatest American rock group, and interestingly, you probably think about this a lot. Most of the most famous American artists are solo artists rather than groups, at least in the rock and roll era, which is
I believe it.
Yeah. So we like Bob Dylan, right? England has like the Beatles.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, we're thinking about.
I will probably think about it not anymore after this conversation.
Okay. I'll do enough for the both of us.
Teaching About the Great Lakes is brought to you by the fine people at Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. We encourage you to check out the cool stuff we do at iicgrant.org and at ILINC Grant on Facebook, Instagram, and other social medias.
Our senior producer is Carolyn Foley. Teach Me About the Great Lakes is produced by Megan, the lake lover Gunn, Renie Miles. Ethan Chitty is our associate producer and our fixer. Our super fun podcast artwork, which features a moose from Isle Royal. Go to Teach Me About the Great Lakes episode 3 with Lorene Neuenheis to hear about her work on the Great Lakes adventurer she is. Anyway, you can go check that out to hear about her work on her adventure on Isle Royal, where she's hucking a moose head all around. Recommended. Strongly recommended. Anyway, that artwork is by Joel Davenport. And the show is edited by Sandra Svoboda, who is got a little voodoo doll situation going on. Oh, I feel the pin.
If you have a question or comment about the show, please email to teachmeaboutthegreatlakes@gmail.com or leave a message on our hotline at 765-496-IISG or 4479. Thank you for listening and keep grading those lakes.